If someone asked why Freedomland closed, most people would give a simple answer. The 1964 World's Fair opened in Queens, siphoned away the crowds, and the park could not compete. That is what the bankruptcy filing said, and it is true as far as it goes. But the real story stretches across 5 summers and involves a Texan who built Disneyland and then was erased from its history. $65 million sunk into Bronx marshland that had been a city dump, a park shaped like a map of the United States that could never decide if it wanted to teach American history or just sell roller coaster tickets, a real estate tycoon who may have planned the demolition before the first child ever walked through the gate, and a fire that burned on schedule every 20 minutes while families lined up to put it out. The closing was not one betrayal. It was built into the foundation, literally into ground, that shifted and sank beneath the weight of the dream. Some decisions were made in boardrooms, and some were made by the weather, and some were made by the calendar before the first shovel broke ground. Freedomland was America's theme park. It lasted exactly as long as the America it celebrated, 5 seasons before everything changed. This is the story of how a dream became a memory and how that memory refused to die. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit subscribe. It only takes a second, but it means a lot and helps support the channel. Thank you, and let's continue. Chapter 1. The Dreamer and the Swamp. To understand any of it, you have to go back to a time when New York City believed it could build anything. The late 1950s hummed with that particular American confidence that followed the war, the sense that concrete and steel and sheer will could reshape the world. Robert Moses was still carving highways through neighborhoods, displacing thousands of families to create arteries of asphalt that would carry automobiles from the suburbs to the city and back again. The suburbs themselves were spreading outward in rings of identical houses and backyard barbecues, Levittown and its imitators offering the American dream in prefabricated packages. America had won the war and was winning the peace, and nowhere was that confidence more palpable than in New York, the city that considered itself the capital of the 20th century. The post-war boom had created a new kind of American family, where one with disposable income and leisure time and an automobile in the driveway. These families wanted entertainment, and they wanted it close to home. The golden age of the amusement park was dawning, though no one knew yet that it would also be the age of the theme park, a distinction that would matter more than anyone realized. Anyone seeking a carnival atmosphere in those years already had options scattered across the metropolitan area. Brooklyn offered Coney Island with its wooden coasters and hot dog stands and boardwalk crowds pressing against the Atlantic. The cyclone had been terrifying riders since 1927, and Nathan's Famous had been selling frankfurters since 1916. Coney Island was democratic and chaotic, and a place where immigrants and working-class families rubbed shoulders with day-tripping Manhattan socialites, all of them united by the smell of salt water and frying oil. Queens had Rockaway's Playland, where families could spend a Sunday afternoon within sight of the ocean. The rides were modest, but the beach was free, and for families counting every nickel, that combination was hard to beat. Across the Hudson in New Jersey stood Palisades Amusement Park, perched on the cliffs above the river with views of the Manhattan skyline that made every ride feel like it was floating above the world. North in Westchester County, Rye Playland welcomed visitors, as it still does today, its Art Deco buildings and carefully maintained grounds offering a more genteel experience than the chaos of Coney Island. Smaller neighborhood amusement areas with names like Post Arrow and the Lollipop Farm dotted the 5 boroughs and Long Island, little pockets of neon and noise tucked between apartment buildings and shopping districts. These were places where a child could spend an allowance on ring tosses and cotton candy, where teenage couples could steal kisses on the Ferris wheel, where families could escape the summer heat of their apartments for a few hours of manufactured excitement. But something larger was coming to the northeast Bronx. The site covered 205 acres at the southern edge of roughly 400 acres of marshland along the Hutchinson River. The actual park and its attractions would occupy 85 acres, which dwarfed Disneyland's 65 acres and made Palisades look like a backyard carnival at just 30. Billboards went up along the highways, promising the world's largest entertainment center. The smell of salt air drifted in from Long Island Sound and mixed with city exhaust as construction equipment rolled toward the water. But that marshland carried a history the billboards never mentioned. It had served as a municipal landfill for years, a place where New York City had dumped its refuse. Garbage trucks had rolled across this ground for decades, depositing layer upon layer of the city's waste. The ground was unstable, prone to settling and sinking, filled with the compressed remnants of everything the city had thrown away. Broken furniture and rotting food and discarded newspapers had decomposed into a treacherous substrate that engineers would struggle to tame. And engineers would need to drive pilings deep into the muck to support any structure. The soil itself was unpredictable, capable of shifting in ways that could crack foundations and buckle walkways. Some areas were more stable than others, but mapping those variations required extensive testing that cost money and time. The Bronx was becoming a place where a man with enough ambition and enough money and the right connections could build something people would talk about for generations. The question was whether the ground would hold. Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood was that man. Born on the 17th of December 1920 in Woods County, Oklahoma, he carried a name that evoked railroad fortunes and Gilded Age ambition, though his own family had no connection to those famous Vanderbilts. The name was coincidence, or perhaps aspiration on the part of his parents, but Wood would spend his life living up to its grandeur. Raised in Amarillo, Texas, he absorbed the frontier spirit of the American Southwest, the belief that empty land was just opportunity waiting to be seized. Wood graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a degree in petroleum engineering, a practical choice in a state built on oil money. But Wood was never going to spend his life staring at drilling reports or calculating extraction rates. He had a gift for talking, for selling, for making other people believe that whatever he was building would be the biggest and best version of its kind. He could walk into a room full of skeptical investors and walk out with their checkbooks open. He could look at empty land and describe what would stand there so vividly that listeners could almost see the buildings rising. That gift caught the attention of Walt Disney. In the early 1950s, Disney was planning something no one had ever attempted, a theme park that would be clean and organized and tell stories instead of just spinning riders until they felt sick. Traditional amusement parks were dirty and dangerous, staffed by carnival workers of questionable character, designed to separate customers from their money as quickly as possible. Disney wanted something different. He wanted a place where families could spend an entire day immersed in carefully crafted experiences, where every detail contributed to a larger narrative, where the employees were cast members and the customers were guests. He needed someone who could actually build the thing, someone who could turn sketches into concrete, someone who could negotiate with contractors and manage construction crews and keep a project of unprecedented complexity on something resembling a schedule. Wood became Disneyland's very first employee, hired in 1953 to make Walt's dream a reality. Wood chose the site among the orange groves of Anaheim, a location that seemed impossibly far from Los Angeles, but offered cheap land and room to grow. He purchased the land parcel by parcel, sometimes using shell companies to prevent speculation from driving up prices. He supervised the construction that transformed a flat California landscape into Tomorrowland and Frontierland and Main Street, USA. Walt and Wood were both fiery and passionate, and they became close very quickly, two men who believed they could will the impossible into existence through sheer force of personality. The partnership was intense and productive, and ultimately doomed. Two visionaries cannot share one vision indefinitely, and both men had egos that demanded recognition. Wood wanted credit for what he had built. Disney wanted control over every aspect of his creation. The friction grew until something had to break. Then, in July of 1956, just 6 months after Disneyland opened to crowds that exceeded every projection, Wood was gone. Not just fired, but erased, scrubbed from the historical accounts of the Disney Company as though he had never walked through those gates. The reasons remained disputed, intertangled in accusations about side deals and conflicts of interest, and two large egos that could not share the same kingdom. Some said Wood had been making unauthorized arrangements with Disneyland vendors. Others said he had been taking credit that belonged to Walt. The truth probably contained elements of both. Wood founded Marco Engineering and hired away Disney employees and billed himself as the master planner of Disneyland until a lawsuit forced him to stop using the title. He had built the happiest place on earth and then been written out of its story. The bitterness of that erasure would fuel him for the rest of his career. Now he would build his own kingdom, this time in the shape of America itself, and this time no one would be able to write him out of the history. Chapter 2. A Map of America. On June 18th, 1960, Freedomland was dedicated in a ceremony with 5,000 people in attendance. Politicians gave speeches, bands played patriotic music, ribbons were cut, and flashbulbs popped. The following day, June 19th, the park officially opened and 65,000 visitors pushed through the gates, a crushing tide of humanity that overwhelmed every expectation and every preparation. That same evening, the Ed Sullivan Show presented a promotional tour of the park and referred to it as Disneyland's equal on the East Coast, the kind of endorsement that money could not buy. Sullivan was the most powerful tastemaker in American entertainment, and his blessing carried weight that no advertising campaign could match. Families across the country watched the broadcast and began planning their own pilgrimages to the Bronx. The park sprawled across 85 acres in the shape of a map of the continental United States, and visitors could walk from one region to another, like giants striding across the nation. The map was oriented with north at the top, so entering the park meant starting in the northeast and working your way west and south. The conceit was charming and educational and allowed for natural theming of each area. Little old New York offered gas-lit streets and a turn-of-the-century atmosphere, brownstones and cobblestones, and the clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages. The buildings recreated a Manhattan that had vanished decades earlier, before the skyscrapers rose and the elevated trains were torn down. Visitors could browse shops selling old-fashioned candy and souvenirs. could watch craftsmen demonstrating trades that had disappeared from modern life. A horse-drawn trolley carried passengers through the streets, the horses carefully trained to navigate the crowds without startling. Old Chicago featured the park's star attraction, the Great Chicago Fire, where individual gas jets ignited buildings every 15 minutes, and children ran to pump fire hoses and douse the flames while their parents watched from behind wooden barricades. The attraction combined spectacle with participation in a way that no other theme park had attempted. You were not just watching history, you were saving the city. The Great Plains spread out with a western fort where daily shootouts erupted between cowboys and bandits. The actors took their roles seriously, rehearsing choreographed gun battles that looked dangerous but followed careful scripts. Children could pose with the cowboys after the show, could sit on horses and wear oversized hats and pretend to be frontier heroes. The fort itself was built to look weathered and authentic, as though it had stood on the prairie for decades. The Old Southwest baked under artificial desert sun with Pueblo-style buildings and Navajo craft demonstrations. Native American artisans showed visitors how to weave blankets and create pottery, educational exhibits that reflected the 1960s understanding of cultural presentation. A stagecoach carried passengers through the dusty landscape, past rock formations and cacti that had been carefully placed to evoke the Arizona desert. San Francisco shook visitors with an earthquake ride that tossed and jerked riders mercilessly enough to make them grab for handrails and shriek. The ride simulated the 1906 earthquake that had destroyed much of the city, using mechanical platforms and special effects to create the sensation of the ground splitting beneath your feet. It was terrifying and exhilarating, the kind of experience that riders would talk about for weeks afterward. New Orleans offered paddle boats on recreated waterways and the lazy charm of the French Quarter. The architecture evoked the wrought iron balconies and narrow streets of the real New Orleans, and the air carried the smell of beignets and chicory coffee. Jazz musicians played on street corners, and visitors could take leisurely boat rides through simulated bayous, complete with animatronic alligators lurking in the artificial swamps. Satellite City rose at the edge of the map like a promise, a town of the future with sleek lines and space-age optimism. This was the 1960s vision of tomorrow, all gleaming white surfaces and atomic-age confidence. The exhibits showed visitors what life might be like in the year 2000, with automated homes and flying cars and colonies on the moon. It was aspirational and naive and utterly sincere in its belief that technology would solve every problem. 37 attractions in all, 8 miles of navigable waterways where boats of various sizes carried passengers through different eras of American history. An 8,500-car parking lot spread across acres of former marshland, the largest parking facility in the New York metropolitan area. 5,000 original costumes worn by historical reenactors who populated the streets and spoke in character to guests, never breaking the illusion that you had actually traveled back in time. The New York Times described the park as a Disneyland-esque panorama of American history, legend, and color for young and old. Another Times article called it the world's largest, newest, and shiniest entertainment park. The superlatives piled up in the press coverage, each outlet trying to outdo the others in capturing the scale of what had been built. But behind the bunting and the fireworks, the numbers told a different story. Freedomland was already $7 million in debt on opening day, the construction costs having spiraled far beyond initial projections. The park hoped to attract 5 million visitors a year, an optimistic target based on the success of Disneyland and the density of the New York metropolitan population. But it needed at least 2 million just to break even, just to cover operating costs and debt service. In its first year, only 1.5 million visitors came through the gates, and that number would never be reached again. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Foundation. The enthusiasm of opening day carried a chaos that the promotional materials had not advertised. On June 19th, an estimated 61,500 visitors overwhelmed the site, and park officials were forced to suspend ticket sales at 2:05 in the afternoon. The turnstiles could not process people fast enough. The parking lot filled and then overfilled with cars lining the access roads for miles. Families who had driven hours found themselves turned away at the gates, their children crying in the back seats. Those who made it inside discovered that many parts of the park were not finished. Drinking fountains did not work, leaving visitors desperate for water on a hot summer day. Restrooms were incomplete, creating long lines and uncomfortable waits. Satellite City and the Chicago Fire attraction would not open for weeks, meaning that visitors who had come specifically to see those headliners found only construction barriers and apologetic signs. The park was only about 85% complete when it welcomed its first paying customers. He'd done a decision driven by debt payments rather than operational readiness. The creditors would not wait for every drinking fountain to be connected. The interest payments came due whether the restrooms worked or not. Management made the calculation that opening with an incomplete park was better than not opening at all, and they were probably right from a financial perspective, even if the decision damaged the park's reputation with those first visitors. 6 days later, the first serious accident occurred. A horse-drawn stagecoach overturned in the Great Plains section and injured 10 people. The horses had spooked at something, perhaps a loud noise or a sudden movement in the crowd, and the driver lost control. The stagecoach tipped and passengers tumbled out onto the hard-packed ground. 3 of the victims were hospitalized, including one with a snapped spine, who faced months of recovery and possible permanent disability. The park initially denied any responsibility, issuing statements that blamed the accident on factors beyond their control. But a visitor publicly released a photograph of the accident that showed the overturned coach and the injured passengers sprawled across the dusty ground. The image appeared in newspapers across the region, and the park's denials became untenable. Lawsuits followed, adding legal costs to the already strained budget. On August 28th, visitors to Freedomland would have witnessed 2 robberies if they had been paying attention. Actors performed a scheduled fake bank robbery as part of the Old West entertainment, the kind of staged spectacle that happened several times daily. The cowboys burst through the saloon doors, fired their blank-loaded pistols into the air, and made their theatrical escape while visitors cheered and took photographs. Only a short distance away, at nearly the same time, 3 armed men with real guns robbed the box office of the day's receipts. They had studied the park's routines and timed their heist to coincide with the fake robbery, knowing that the sound of gunfire would not attract attention. They escaped with more than $28,000 in cash, a substantial sum in 1960 dollars. The thieves were arrested 2 weeks later and identified as employees of the park, men who had used their inside knowledge to plan and execute the crime. At the end of September, local news media reported that Freedomland had failed to pay the city a 5% amusement tax totaling $148,200. The tax was paid by the following week, but the story added to a growing sense that the grand enterprise was struggling. Newspapers that had celebrated the opening now ran skeptical stories about the park's finances. The narrative was shifting from triumph to trouble. The stagecoach accident, the robbery, the unpaid taxes. These were symptoms. The disease was structural. The marshland that had once been a municipal dump was proving unstable in ways the engineers had underestimated. Buildings shifted on their foundations as the compressed garbage beneath them continued to settle. Foundations cracked as different sections of ground sank at different rates. Walkways developed uneven surfaces that required constant repair, creating tripping hazards that added to the park's liability concerns. The ground that New York had used to bury its garbage was now slowly swallowing the structures built on top of it. Every spring, when the park reopened after its winter closure, maintenance crews would discover new damage caused by the freeze-thaw cycle and the relentless settling of the unstable soil. The costs of these repairs ate into already thin margins, and some damage could never be fully fixed. Chapter 4. The Illusion of Saving History. Old Chicago rose from the northeastern section of the park as a recreation of 1870s Chicago, all wooden facades and gas lamps, and the bustling atmosphere of a Midwestern metropolis on the rise. Wooden buildings crowded together along narrow streets, their signs advertising dry goods and hardware and hotels. The smell of sawdust and popcorn mixed in the air with the occasional whiff of gas from the lamps. The architecture was meticulous in its period accuracy, recreating a city that had been destroyed nearly a century earlier. Windows displayed merchandise that would have been familiar to 19th century shoppers. Awnings shaded wooden sidewalks. Horse-drawn wagons rolled past, their drivers calling out to pedestrians. For visitors who had never been to Chicago, this was Chicago. For those who had, it was a Chicago that no longer existed. But the centerpiece of old Chicago was not a building or a street or a shop. It was destruction itself. The Great Chicago Fire exhibit used controlled gas jets and special effects to simulate the 1871 conflagration that had destroyed much of the real city. Flames would leap from windows and crawl up walls, while bells clanged and actors shouted warnings. Smoke billowed into the air, thick enough to be dramatic, but carefully controlled to avoid actually endangering visitors. The narration drew visitors into the story, broadcast over loudspeakers that carried the words across the crowded streets. The date is October 8th, 1871. You are walking on a busy downtown street in Chicago, enjoying the sights and sounds of the old city when a cry of fire fills the air. Fire bells begin to ring. You turn your head just in time to see the doors of the old-fashioned red brick firehouse swing open. An old-time hand pump engine is wheeled out and pulled down the streets of the city. Suddenly, you see the flames. They are coming from all over the city. Quick, no time to lose. The call goes out for volunteers to help man the pumps. That fire became Freedomland. More than the earthquake ride, more than the stern wheelers on the Great Lakes, more than the cowboys shooting it out in the Old Southwest. For 5 summers, it was the thing children talked about on the drive home, the experience they described to classmates on Monday morning, the memory that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Parents would hoist their kids up so they could help put out the Great Chicago Fire by manning one of the water pumps. The pumps were real, connected to real hoses that sprayed real water. You would grip the iron bars and pull up and down and down, feeling the resistance as the water surged through the system. A steady stream of water would shoot out of the long, snake-like fire hose, arcing toward the flames that danced on the building facades. You would continue to pump until finally the fire was out, the gas jets extinguished by some hidden mechanism that responded to the water or simply to a timer. You would hear hands clapping and look up to see that a crowd had gathered to watch your heroics. Other families waiting for their turn, other children eager to take the pump handles and save the city themselves. Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over that lantern every 20 minutes, so you were bound to get a chance to be a volunteer and receive an official firefighter's certificate to take home as proof of your heroism. The certificates were simple pieces of paper, mass-produced and handed out by the thousands, but children treasured them. Some families still have those certificates, yellowed and fragile now, tucked into scrapbooks or framed on walls. When people who visited Freedomland are asked what they remember, the Chicago fire is the part of the park they mention first, not the rides, not the shows, not the elaborate recreations of American history. The fire, the pumps, the feeling of being part of something larger than yourself, of saving a city from destruction, even if you knew somewhere in the back of your mind that the city was made of plywood and the fire was made of gas jets. It was always a winner to me, one visitor recalled decades later, especially the Chicago fire. The memory had stayed sharp across half a century, the sensation of those pump handles still vivid in aging hands. Every 20 minutes, Chicago burned. Every 20 minutes, children saved it. It was the perfect metaphor for what Freedomland was trying to be, a place where history repeated itself in ways that felt both dangerous and safe, where you could experience catastrophe and always know it would end well. What no one knew was that the park itself would not get that guarantee. Chapter 5. The Money Behind the Magic. The ownership of Freedomland was never as simple as a man with a vision building a park. The park was built on marshland owned by Webb and Knapp, a company controlled by William Zeckendorf Sr., and that connection shaped everything that followed. To understand why Freedomland was doomed, you have to understand who owned the ground it stood on. Zeckendorf was not a showman or an entertainer. He was a real estate developer, one of the most ambitious of his era, a man who thought in terms of square footage and zoning regulations and return on investment. Born in 1905, he had joined Webb and Knapp in 1938 as a young man hungry to make his mark in Manhattan real estate. By 1949, he had purchased control of the company, and he began assembling a portfolio that would make him one of the most powerful developers in America. By 1959, Webb and Knapp had assets of nearly $300 million and owned hotels and office buildings and shopping centers in 17 states and Canada. Zeckendorf thought in terms of urban transformation, of buying undervalued properties and repositioning them for maximum return. He had a gift for seeing potential where others saw only problems, art for imagining glass towers where others saw only tenements. He had owned the Bronx marshland since the early 1950s, years before anyone proposed building a theme park on it. The land was cheap because it was difficult, former landfill that would require extensive preparation before anything substantial could be built. Zeckendorf was patient. He knew that the right opportunity would come along eventually. The connection between Zeckendorf and Wood came through the success of Disneyland. After Wood left Disney, he developed theme parks in Colorado and Massachusetts and Texas, building a reputation as the man who could replicate the Disneyland magic. He had the experience and the credibility and the burning desire to prove that he could succeed without Walt Disney's name attached to the project. Zeckendorf saw an opportunity. He had this swampy land in the Bronx that nobody wanted, land that had been sitting on his books for years, waiting for a use. And he had a theme park developer who needed a major project, who needed a chance to show what he could do on his own. The partnership made sense on paper. Wood would design and operate the park. Zeckendorf would provide the land and access to financing. Both men would profit when the crowds came pouring through the gates. To most visitors, none of this mattered. You walked through the gate, and it was all Freedomland. You did not see the lease agreements or the construction loans that had ballooned from $15.5 million projected to $65 million actual. You did not see the pension funds waiting in the wings or the housing developers who already had plans for this marshland. You saw Chicago burning and cowboys shooting and paddle wheels churning through artificial bayous. But some fans who have studied the park's history believe that Zeckendorf conspired with Wood to build federally subsidized housing on the site all along, that Freedomland was never meant to last. The theory sounds paranoid until you look at the evidence. A news story at the park's opening claimed its buildings were built to last 50 years, but historian Michael Vergentino believes the structures were built just to prove the marshy Bronx shoreline could support multi-story apartment buildings. The construction of Freedomland, in this interpretation, was an elaborate proof of concept. Could you drive pilings into this unstable ground and build structures that would stand? Could you create foundations that would not crack as the landfill beneath them continued to settle? The theme park would answer those questions, and the answers would be valuable to anyone planning to build permanent housing on the same site. Freedomland was never just a theme park. It was a 5-year experiment to see if the swamp could bear weight. And when the experiment succeeded, when the building stood and the ground held well enough, the real development could begin. Chapter 6: The Golden Summers. For the boys and girls who are now 60 and older, Freedomland continues to rekindle fond memories that time has not dimmed. Freedomland occupies a special place in that landscape of memory because it was theirs in a way that Disneyland could never be. California was 3,000 miles away, an impossible distance for a working-class family in the Bronx or Brooklyn or Queens. The plane tickets alone would cost more than a month's rent. The drive would take days and require motels and gas and meals on the road. But Freedomland was right there, less than an hour from Times Square, accessible by subway and bus, affordable for families who counted every dollar. You could wake up in your apartment in the morning and be walking through the gates of Freedomland by lunchtime. You could spend the whole day there and still be home in time for dinner. Imagine growing up during the early 1960s and traveling to a New York City destination for an all-day fun-filled history lesson. Hundreds of thousands of kids entered this time machine into America's past with their mothers and fathers, cousins and friends, aunts and uncles, and with their grandmothers and grandfathers. 3 generations sharing the experience, grandparents who remembered the actual turn of the century walking through recreations of their childhood, parents marveling at how different the world had become, children absorbing history without realizing they were learning. The anticipation began days before the visit, fueled by a jingle that played on the radio and on television. "Mommy, Daddy, take my hand. Take me out to Freedomland." The melody was simple and impossible to forget, the kind of earworm that lodged in your brain and stayed there for decades. Children would sing it in the car on the way to the park, would hum it while waiting in line, would remember it 60 years later when asked about their childhood. The first stop was often little old New York. Horseless carriages and surreys filled the streets, their engines puttering or their horses clip-clopping, depending on which vehicle you chose. A German Oompa band played, while several shops down the street, someone was robbing the bank. Actors in theatrical masks waving prop pistols and shouting threats that made children shriek with delighted fear. A horse-drawn trolley took you to Chicago, where every 20 minutes you could help save the city from flames. The transition between sections was seamless, the theming consistent, so that you felt like you were actually traveling across the country rather than just walking through a park. After the fire was extinguished, the curio shop next door held a fire sale, a joke that adults appreciated and children did not quite understand. Paddle-wheelers made their way across the Great Lakes, their steam whistles echoing across the water. To get to San Francisco, you could board an old iron horse on the Santa Fe Railroad and feel the rumble of the tracks beneath you, the whistle blowing as you pulled out of the station. The Crystal Maze was the very first house of mirrors maze in the world, a disorienting labyrinth of reflections where you could spend half an hour trying to find your way out. The Tornado Adventure simulated a Louisiana tornado, complete with a flying cow, years before any Hollywood movie thought to attempt the same effect. The Old Southwest featured an amazing cast of characters, including the most beloved character actor in the park, a man who played Digger O'Toole and took away the bodies after the high noon standoff, or as children would remember him longer than they remembered the cowboys who had done the shooting. There was something fascinating about the Undertaker, the man who cleaned up after the violence, who treated the dead with a macabre humor that made death seem less frightening. The Moon Bowl was a huge attraction, a concert venue where performances were free with admission. In its 5-year run, it featured over 150 performers, a roster that reads like a history of American popular music. Louis Armstrong performed at the Moon Bowl for 8 days in 1961 and returned again Labor Day weekend of 1964, his trumpet soaring over the Bronx marshland. The talent roster included Nat King Cole and Bobby Darin and Patti Page and Paul Anka and Tony Bennett and Count Basie. For families who could never afford to see these performers in Manhattan nightclubs, who could never get past the velvet ropes and the cover charges, the Moon Bowl brought the music to them under open Bronx skies. You could see Louis Armstrong for the price of a theme park ticket. Freedomland was the answer for every lower middle-class family with no prospect of ever seeing Disneyland. Adults paid $1 for admission, and kids paid 50 cents. One visitor remembered decades later that for $5, his family of 8 went to the world's largest entertainment center and still had money for each child to buy a souvenir. The same visitor shared a memory that carried both joy and pain. Every long once in a while when his father sobered up, he would have some guilt and the family would have a great day, and that was one of them. The memory was treasured not because everything was perfect, but because for a few hours everything felt possible. Freedomland could not fix a family's problems, but it could provide an escape from them, a day when the troubles waiting at home seemed very far away. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The real problem for a Northeast theme park was always going to be the weather. While Disneyland could attract visitors year-round under California sunshine, Freedomland had to contend with the months of October through April when the park stood empty and silent. The winter weather wreaked havoc on the attractions, freezing pipes and warping wooden structures, and cracking the facades that had been built to look weathered, but not to actually weather. Staff needed to be employed year-round to maintain the grounds. But no revenue came in during those cold months. Security guards patrolled empty streets. Maintenance workers repaired damage caused by snow and ice and wind. The heating bills alone were substantial, necessary to prevent pipes from bursting and equipment from freezing solid. The marshland beneath the park continued its slow work of settling and shifting, and each spring brought new cracks and new repairs. Buildings that had been level in September were tilted by April. Walkways that had been smooth developed buckles and ridges. The constant repair work consumed resources that should have gone toward improving attractions and marketing the park. The seasonal closure meant that Freedomland had roughly 5 months each year to earn enough money to survive the other 7. Disneyland could spread its debt service across 12 months of revenue. Freedomland had to pay the same bills with less than half the operating time. The math was brutal from the beginning, and it only got worse. By 1962, the park's identity had begun to fracture under financial pressure. Management added late-night movies and more conventional rides and concerts, trying to attract teenagers who wanted entertainment rather than education. The strategy brought in a new demographic, but it alienated the sponsors who had invested in an American history theme park. The Benjamin Moore Paint Company sued Freedomland for $150,000, claiming the park had violated its agreement by becoming a hub for commonplace and vulgar mass unrestrained teenage entertainment. Benjamin Moore had sponsored the paint shop in Little Old New York on the understanding that Freedomland would maintain its educational mission. Instead, the company found its name associated with rock concerts and makeout sessions. The history was played down, and Freedomland became just an amusement park with bumper cars and roller coasters. The educational exhibits that had made the park special were neglected in favor of attractions that would sell more tickets. The carefully researched period details that had impressed critics at the opening were allowed to deteriorate. The map of America remained, but the America it depicted was becoming generic. Then came November 22, 1963. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and the event often described as the day the nation lost its innocence brought on a cultural shift that no one could have predicted. The optimism that had fueled the post-war boom began to curdle into anxiety and doubt. The space race continued, but it no longer felt like pure adventure. The civil rights movement was revealing injustices that complicated the triumphalist narrative of American history. Lighter diversions, like amusement parks, became less popular as the national mood darkened. Families who might have spent a Saturday at Freedomland stayed home instead, watching news coverage of a world that seemed increasingly dangerous and uncertain. Freedomland had been built to celebrate an idealized American past, and now that past felt less comforting than it once had. By 1963, the owners sold off a portion of Freedomland's site to a pension fund of the Teamsters and closed off an entire section of the park. Visitors who returned that summer found a smaller Freedomland, fences blocking paths that had once led to attractions. The San Francisco section was largely shuttered. The map of America was shrinking. The 1964 New York World's Fair opened in Queens, and bankruptcy was declared during late 1964. Management publicly cited competition from the fair as the cause, a convenient narrative that avoided more embarrassing explanations. The World's Fair was new and exciting, they argued, and families chose to spend their entertainment dollars there instead. But only much later did the actual story emerge. Competition from the World's Fair did not significantly affect operations. The fair had been announced years before Freedomland even opened, plenty of time for the park's business plan to account for it. The fair became the convenient public excuse for a closing that had been building since before the first visitor walked through the gate. In the space of 4 years, Freedomland had been transformed. What opened as an animated history book had become just another amusement park. The fire still burned in old Chicago every 20 minutes, and children still pumped water to put it out. But the rest of the park had lost its soul. Each year the park grew smaller. San Francisco was closed off by the later seasons, the earthquake ride silent. Walkways that had led to attractions now led to fences with apologetic signs. The map of America that guests walked across was shrinking, states disappearing as if the country itself were contracting. The dream was dying in pieces. The debt spiral had begun before the park ever opened, when construction costs ballooned from $15.5 million projected to $65 million actual. By the end of the 1961 season, Freedomland carried $8 million in debt. Interest accumulated. Creditors demanded payment. New loans were taken out to service old loans. The attendance numbers told their own story of decline. The park ultimately saw 1.5 million visitors in its opening year, and that statistic was never surpassed. Each subsequent year brought fewer visitors than the year before. The families who had come eagerly in 1960 did not return in 1961. The word of mouth was not good enough to attract new visitors to replace them. Behind Freedomland stood Webb and Knapp, and Webb and Knapp was dying. William Zeckendorf had built a real estate empire on borrowed money, leveraging each acquisition to finance the next. The strategy worked brilliantly when property values rose, but it left no margin for error. By 1959, his debts had reached $104 million, a staggering sum that required constant refinancing to manage. Webb and Knapp lost $19.6 million in 1962 and $32.3 million in 1963. The company that owned the land beneath Freedomland was collapsing under its own weight, selling off assets to meet debt payments, unable to invest in the properties it still held. Zeckendorf's empire was crumbling, and Freedomland would be crushed in the collapse. Chapter 8. What Remains. On September 13, 1964, Freedomland closed its gates for the very last time. No announcement warned visitors that this Sunday would be different from any other September Sunday. Families walked out through the turnstiles and looked back at the map of America spread across the Bronx marshland, and they assumed they would return next summer. They made plans for next year, promised children that they could ride the train again, discussed which attractions they had missed and wanted to see. The next day, the company filed for bankruptcy. The announcement came without warning, a Monday morning press release that ended 5 years of dreams. An historian, Michael Virgintino, concluded that the World's Fair was unlikely to be the main reason for the bankruptcy. The evidence simply did not support that narrative. Freedomland had never made a profit in any of its 5 years of operation. Not one single season ended in the black. The park was losing money from the moment it opened, and the losses compounded year after year until the debt became unsustainable. There would be no final season. There would be no summer of goodbyes, no last ride through San Francisco, no final fire in old Chicago with crowds gathered to commemorate what they were losing. Without even knowing it, the families who had spent their summers at Freedomland had already had their last summer there. Children who had pumped water on the Chicago fire that September carried certificates home that became artifacts of something vanished, souvenirs of a place that would never exist again. The demolition began almost immediately, and by early 1966, most of Freedomland's remaining structures were torn down. The speed of the destruction fuels conspiracy theories to this day. A theme park that had cost $65 million to build was erased from the landscape in a matter of months. Buildings that had supposedly been built to last 50 years were reduced to rubble in weeks. The gigantic Co-op City housing development rose on the site as though Freedomland had never existed. Construction crews who had torn down old Chicago began building apartment towers. It was the same ground that had supported the Great Plains in San Francisco and New Orleans would now support homes for tens of thousands of New Yorkers. Their goal was always, let's use the land as we can now until a better opportunity comes along, Virgintino explained. Freedomland was doomed from the start. The theme park had served its purpose, proving that the marshland could support substantial construction, generating some revenue while the developers waited for the right moment to build housing. When that moment came, the park was disposable. The park did not vanish entirely. Pieces of it scattered across the country like fragments of a broken mirror, finding new homes at other amusement parks that were happy to acquire proven attractions at bankruptcy prices. One of the big sternwheeler boats was moved to the Byram River between Greenwich, Connecticut, and Port Chester, New York, where it supposedly still serves as a restaurant. Diners eat where families once cruised the Great Lakes. San Francisco's Earthquake Ride and New Orleans Buccaneers, renamed the Pirate Ride, were moved to Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio, in 1966. The rides operated for years under different names, thrilling visitors who had no idea they were experiencing a piece of Bronx history. The tugboat Totsie operated for many years at Quasi Amusement Park in Middlebury, Connecticut. If you knew where to look, you could still find pieces of Freedomland decades later, orphaned attractions operating under different names in different states. Where Freedomland once spread its map of America across the Bronx marshland, 35 high-rise buildings and 7 clusters of townhouses now stand. Co-op City opened officially in 1969 and became the largest residential development in the United States. Its 15,372 residential units house approximately 50,000 people on 320 acres. The development is its own small city with schools and shopping centers and community facilities, serving a population larger than many American towns. Co-op City developed its own complicated story, one that echoed some of the same themes that had doomed Freedomland. By the early 1970s, cost overruns and structural flaws led to financial crisis. The buildings that were supposed to provide affordable housing for working-class families became sources of anxiety and frustration as construction defects emerged and carrying costs rose. The cooperative's residents organized one of the largest tenant protests in United States history. The Co-op City rent strike of 1975 through 1976 lasted 13 months as residents withheld payments to demand financial transparency and democratic reform. Families who had invested their savings in their apartments refused to pay another dime until the cooperative's management explained where the money had gone and gave residents a voice in how the community was run. Their eventual success restructured the project's debt and solidified resident control. The community that replaced Freedomland had to fight for its own survival, and, unlike the amusement park, it won. Co-op City endures today, a functioning community where Freedomland could not survive. The ground that could not hold a theme park for 5 years has held 50,000 people for 5 decades. Perhaps the problem was never the land. Perhaps the problem was what we asked it to be. A small commemorative plaque stands in Co-op City today, placed near where the entrance gate once welcomed visitors. The marker was erected in 2013 by Michael Virgintino and other fans who refused to let Freedomland vanish entirely from public memory. On this Co-op City site in 1960 through 1964 was the entrance to Freedomland USA. The plaque reads, "Children walk past that plaque every day on their way to school. They have never heard of the Great Chicago Fire that burned every 20 minutes, or the stern wheelers on the Great Lakes, or the gunfight in the Old Southwest where Digger O'Toole collected the bodies. They have never heard the jingle, 'Mommy, Daddy, take my hand, take me out to Freedomland.' The map of America that their grandparents walked across has been replaced by apartment buildings where their families sleep and eat and live ordinary lives. But the memories persist. None of the similarly short-lived parks from that era have garnered the level of obsessive nostalgia that Freedomland has. Judging from the hundreds of personal memories posted to the Freedomland USA and East Bronx History Forum Facebook pages, the Bronx lost a valued piece of its identity when the gates closed. The posts keep coming, year after year, from people who visited once as children and never forgot. "I was only there once as a little boy," one fan named Christopher Arena wrote, "but I never forgot it." That single visit, perhaps a single afternoon more than 60 years ago, left an impression that nothing else in a lifetime of experiences could erase. The Facebook page still grows. The memories still arrive, posted by grandparents who were children once, who remember the smell of the hot dogs and the sound of the German band, and the feeling of the pump handles beneath their palms as they saved Chicago from the flames. They share photographs and ticket stubs and firefighter certificates, fragments of evidence that the place they remember actually existed. And somewhere in Connecticut, a sternwheeler still rocks gently in a river. Somewhere in Ohio, rides that once carried passengers through time in the Bronx still operate under different names. And in Co-op City, where the towers rise from the old marshland, 50,000 people live where Freedomland used to dream. The fire went out in 1964, but the memory still burns.